A girl had just finished nursing school and started working in a new hospital. Although she loved her job as a nurse, she found it difficult to get along with the people she worked with. They were mostly young doctors who had just finished medical school. The problem was that they delighted in pulling pranks on each other. She found it very difficult to live with them in the residence next to the hospital because they stayed up late and made too much noise. The nurse worked very long hours and needed all the sleep she could get. Whenever she complained about their behavior, the mischievous doctors just laughed in her face and told her to shut up. The nurse eventually had to report the young doctors to the hospital manager, and they got in all kinds of trouble. The doctors began to really hate the nurse and spent days devising a plan to get revenge on her. Finally, one of the doctors came up with a really sick prank that they could play on the nurse, and the others gladly agreed to help. That night, they broke into the mortuary in the hospital basement and sawed off the arm of a corpse. Then they snuck up to the nurse's bedroom and they put the severed arm under her bedclothes. They placed it at the bottom of the bed so that when she laid down, her feet would touch it. Chuckling to themselves, they stood around in the hallway, waiting for the young nurse to go to bed. As the girl went into her bedroom, the doctors had to stop themselves from laughing out loud. The nurse was suspicious of their behavior, but she was too tired to care and went into her bedroom, closing the door behind her. The men waited impatiently in the hallway for the nurse to find the severed arm in her bed, but nothing happened. There was no screams, no angry yelling, only silence. After a while, the doctors got fed up with waiting around and decided to turn in for the night. They assumed that they placed the severed arm too far down in the bed, and the nurse must not have felt it. The next morning, when they woke up, the doctors went to check on the nurse. Receiving no answer when they knocked on her door, they turned the handle and went inside. The room seemed completely empty. The doctors searched the nurse's bedroom, and when they opened her closet, they were greeted with a horrible sight. The nurse was curled up in the corner of the closet. Her hair had turned completely white, and her eyes were rolled back in her head, and she had gone totally insane. Her face looked like it had aged 20 years, and worst of all, she was chewing on the severed arm. A married couple lived in a small house in Japan with their son and daughter. The son was very angry with his sister and wanted to play a really nasty prank on her. He decided that he would secretly videotape her on the toilet and then post the video online. He wanted to humiliate his sister in front of her friends. The boy hid a video camera under a towel in the bathroom. Minutes later, his sister went to the bathroom and locked the door behind her. She never came out again. Her mother started to wonder what was taking her daughter so long. She banged on the bathroom door and called out the girl's name, but got no reply. Worried, she told her husband, and eventually they managed to force the door open. What they found inside the bathroom filled them with horror. Their daughter was lying in a pool of blood on the tiled floor. She had been stabbed to death. Her face was so sliced up that she was unrecognizable, and her tongue had been cut off. There was a bloody sickle lying on the floor beside her. The police were called immediately, and they came to investigate the scene. Inspecting the bathroom, they found that it posed a mystery. The door had been locked from the inside, the window was securely latched, and the bathroom was so small that nobody could have been hiding inside, lying and waiting for the girl. So how was she murdered? The police saw that the only possible entrance was a small vent in the wall, measured only 10 inches by 10 inches. Nobody could have fit through such a small space. The police were absolutely stumped. They could not figure out how anyone would have gotten inside to kill the girl. The police carefully dusted the sickle for fingerprints, but unfortunately, they found none. At this point, they felt that the case would never be solved. They questioned the mother and the father, but when it came time to question the son, he was nowhere to be found. They searched the house and eventually found him curled up in a wardrobe. His eyes were wild, and he was sobbing uncontrollably. His hands were shaking violently, They noticed that he was holding a video camera. Unable to question him, the police decided to review the videotape. What they saw in the footage would terrify them for years to come. They pressed play on the video camera, and the screen showed the young girl sitting on the toilet. When she finished and stood up, the police noticed some movement in the small vent behind the toilet. A tiny figure emerged noiselessly from the vent. It was carrying the sickle. The police could hardly believe what they were seeing. The figure measured only 6 inches in height. It jumped onto the girl's back, and before she had a chance to scream, it sliced open her throat with the sickle. Then it began stabbing the girl until she was dead. But the horror was not over then. The tiny figure sliced the girl's face and cut out her tongue. Afterwards, the figure approached the video camera. The figure's face was that of an old, wrinkled woman. It looked directly into the lens and hissed, "You're next." Then the tiny figure disappeared back through the small vent, carrying the girl's severed tongue. After watching the videotape, the police officers wiped tears from their eyes. Some of them vomited on the floor. Today, the case remains unsolved, and the tiny woman has never been identified, if she truly exists. The videotape still exists, but the police refuse to release it to the public. It sits in an evidence locker at the police station. The police call this case the Sickle Mystery and refuse to discuss it to the media. On Halloween night in 2002, 4 young girls were walking down a lonely street when they passed by an old church. Standing outside was a man dressed in a clown costume. He asked the girls if they had seen his puppy. When they said they hadn't seen it, the man asked them to help him find it. The girls agreed to help in the search, and the man in the clown costume led them into the church. As soon as they went through the door, the man locked it behind him, trapping them in the old building. The girls realized that they had been tricked, but it was too late. They tried to flee, but he was too fast for them. The man tied up the girls and kept them in the old church for hours. He did unspeakable things to them, and their screams echoed off in the marble walls, the wooden rafters, and the ceiling. After he had his fun, the poor unfortunate girls thought he would let them go, but they were wrong. He killed them, one by one, and then escaped into the night. People who saw the clown walking down the street didn't think anything of it because it was Halloween night. If only they had known that his clown costume was red because it was covered in blood. The next morning, the local priest was surprised to find the church doors unlocked. He went inside, and in the darkness, he heard a mysterious dripping sound. As he walked down the aisle, he saw a pool of blood lying on the altar. He quickly turned on all the lights in the church. The dripping sound was coming from the headless bodies of the 4 girls that were hanging upside down from the rafters. Their blood was dripping down from the bloody stumps of their necks and forming a pool on the altar. But the worst was yet to come. The girls' bodies were buried in the small cemetery behind the church. Just a few weeks later, their parents received 4 mysterious packages in the mail. When their parents unwrapped the packages and opened the boxes, they were filled with terror. The boxes contained the severed heads of their dead daughters. Some people say that if you visit that old church on Halloween night, you will see the ghosts of the 4 young girls standing on the altar. According to legend, you can still hear their screams echoing in the darkness. To this day, the man who murdered the girls has never been found. On a dark Halloween night in 2003, a bus driver was traveling down a deserted street when he saw a beautiful young woman at the side of the road. He stopped at the bus stop, and she climbed on board. The woman took a seat in the back of the bus and stared straight ahead. When the bus driver looked in his mirror, he noticed the woman was staring directly at him, never blinking. But when he looked back over his shoulder, the woman was sitting with her back to him. The driver began to get really creeped out. He couldn't understand what was going on. Then, he came to the end of his route. It was the last stop, and he pulled over and opened the doors of the bus. The woman didn't get out. She just sat there, motionless, with her back to him. The driver walked towards the back of the bus and saw that the woman was covering her face with her hands. He tried talking to her, but she wouldn't answer. He took hold of her arms and tried to make her show her face. The woman refused and struggled out of his grip. Finally, she spoke. "You will not like what you see." And suddenly, she dropped her hands and turned. Her face was horribly disfigured, with lumps of flesh falling off, and her skeletal face could be seen beneath. It is said that they found the bus driver the next morning, lying unconscious outside the bus. He spent 2 weeks in a coma, and when he woke up, he had lost all control of his senses. They put him in a mental institution, and this is a story he told from his cell. One night, I went to the theater to see a movie. There was a horror film festival about classic zombie movies. Because I had nothing to do, I decided to go and see one. I paid for my ticket and bought a bag of chips and a large soft drink at the counter. Then, I made my way into the darkened theater and found a seat. The theater was almost empty. There were only a few other people watching the movie. In the row behind me, there was an old man, and sitting to my right, 3 seats down, there was a big fat man. The lights went out completely and the movie started. I got comfortable in my seat and began munching on my chips and sipping on my drink. The movie was actually pretty scary. After a few minutes, I heard a loud, irritating laugh. Looking to my right, I saw the fat man bouncing around in his seat and laughing uncontrollably. He threw his head back at every horrible scene and yelled. It was extremely annoying. A few minutes later, the old man in the row behind us leaned forward and placed his hand on the fat man's shoulder. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "You are disturbing me with your laughter. Can you please be quiet?" The fat man scowled and turned around in a rude manner. He refused to be quiet and told the man to mind his own business. I would have liked to stand up and tell the fat man to shut up, but I didn't have the guts. A few minutes later, I was sitting there watching the movie when I noticed I didn't hear the fat man's annoying laugh anymore. I glanced over at him and saw that he was asleep. He was slumped over in his chair with his head back and his mouth open. I hope he doesn't start snoring, I thought to myself as I continued to munch on my chips. After a while, I happened to glance at the fat man again. He was still lying there motionless. Then, I happened to notice a dark patch beneath his seat. It looked kind of like a puddle, spreading out beneath him. As I was staring at him, the screen got brighter for a few moments. I could see clearly, and I gasped in horror. The fat man's neck had been sliced open from ear to ear, and blood was dripping down in front of him, forming the pool on the floor. All of a sudden on the movie screen, a zombie appeared out of nowhere and attacked someone. I let out a high-pitched scream and almost jumped out of my seat. Just then, I felt a hand on my shoulder and a voice say, "Excuse me, sir, you are disturbing me with your screams and your constant munching. Can you please be quiet?"